So the people see the recording. Welcome back to the Azure podcast. Today is the 21st of April, 2021. And on Teams with me, we have myself, Cynthia, Suji Kale, and our special guest, John Savill. This is episode 374. And we're lucky to have John today with us talk about how he's staying current with all the different updates that come up about Azure all the time. And as usual, before we jump into our special guest, we have a couple different updates to share. Kale, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I just got three things today. The first one being about operators, Azure for operators. So for those who might not know, that revolves around some networking and integration of like a cellular core network as part of the hyperscale cloud. And so there's a nice write-up here about like some of the research that's been done around that, bringing cellular into the cloud and extending networks and creating these much more connected scenarios. And so it kind of walks through some of the stuff that's been lesson learned about like in going down this path on this Azure for operators. There's also a link to a ton of documentation around like way more detail about this, but basically goes through the microservices that were created there, some of the automation, the self-healing, defending, optimizations, all the different pieces that go around that. So it's a really neat thing to kind of think about like where the future is with extending the cloud beyond what we know of today. So that's a pretty nice article on that. Two other ones. One is I kind of stumbled into this when this Azure Fun Bites, which is like a weekly, looks like something done on YouTube with some folks from Microsoft, and they basically walk through different episodes. They walk through different things like creating chatbots, machine learning, a lot of AI stuff. So it's pretty neat stuff for those who want to like pick up something along with the Azure podcast. So it's a kind of an interesting little thing. I think it's on Twitch and Twitter and all those kind of things. They have a YouTube channel, but they walk through a lot of different scenarios there, which is really neat. And the last one was again around machine learning, which was there's a preview of some integration with VS Code. So for those who are using Visual Studio Code and you're doing things with ML, there's a nice kind of thing in preview now to help you connect to compute instances running in Azure remotely to deploy different things that you're building as part of your machine learning data sets and whatnot that you're doing there. So pretty neat integration. Take a look at it.
Awesome. I also had two that I wanted to share. One is that open source API portal is now GA, and what that API portal is a way to create and publish a customized site with API documentation, and it's free and you don't have to write code. There's a lot of GitHub integration already, and it relies on the same technology that API management developer portal uses. So if you're already familiar with that, then the API portal is like an open source version of it that you get to utilize for free for these API documentation. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that Microsoft announced plans to establish the first data center region in Malaysia. There's a huge effort between Microsoft and Malaysia to empower an estimated of 1 million Malaysians by the end of 2023. So just something really exciting that especially people in Southeast Asia might want to know about. Suji, anything from you?
No, what I was going to ask though, Kale mentioned about some of these episodes on Twitch. Do a lot of people listen to like podcast style shows on Twitch? Is that something we should look into?
I think it's a bit more just my feedback on that. There's been a bunch of different folks at Microsoft specifically that I know of that are using Twitch to reach out to specifically like the developer community. But mostly it's visual, right? So anytime you want to like walk through something and show it, I think we've kind of always been audio podcasts. So for people who are, going for a jog or doing their normal day routine, they can listen to this stuff. But like it's definitely a visual thing, like with Twitch. I don't know of anybody just like doing that from an audio only perspective, but that's my only feedback.
Yeah, like when I'm doing my Iron Man, I could be listening to the podcast as well, right? I guess.
Of course. John can comment to that because I'm sure he was doing that.
There you go.
And now over to John. John, can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners what you do at Microsoft?
Definitely. So thank you for having me on today. So yeah, my name is John Savill. My current role is I'm a principal cloud solution architect. So what that really means is I help some of our customers solve the requirements they have, solve the challenges they're facing with our solutions based in Azure. So that's helping them understand, hey, what the capabilities are, what an architecture would look like, maybe help them do a proof of concept, but really just help them establish those services up in Azure. Before that, I worked in the Microsoft Technology Center for a number of years, which is where, again, we do a lot of architecture with customers and we can kind of showcase things and help them. So my career at Microsoft has always been around kind of the architecture side and just having the opportunity to work with our customers, understand what they're trying to do and help them do it.
One thing I always like to ask the CSAs that come on the show is, what are you seeing as patterns that your customers are adopting, right? What kind of workloads are they looking for to move to Azure? What are there some like big bucket items or categories that you can think of?
Yeah, it varies very greatly by customer. Some of them are just trying to get out of the data center business. And so the things they're trying to move first are kind of like VMs and maybe Kubernetes clusters, kind of things that, hey, it's almost like a lift and shift. I can move it without any kind of big re-architecture. I'm swapping this box on-prem to a box in Azure. And obviously there's more to it than that, but fundamentally I'm moving stuff. But then you get the other customers that like Azure because, well, there are these services available that I don't have on premises. When we start getting into those paths, you talked about the AI technologies, the machine learning things, those richer services, the managed offerings. Well, those sort of customers are more interested in, hey, look, I want to do something special. I want to really differentiate what I do as a company. And I don't do that by just using VMs. What are those extra services? So I see those two big buckets. You see those that just want to get out the data center and get to the cloud. And then those that, hey, I want to take advantage of all this goodness in the cloud that maybe I can't do very easily on premises. So they're the two big buckets I tend to see.
So kind of following up on that, once the customers that are used to on-prem data centers move into the cloud, how do you help them understand? Because a lot of the concepts are similar, but yet there's more that's different. And I think it almost requires a mindset shift of now I'm in the cloud. What am I managing? I'm not managing hardware anymore.
Yeah, so that's always a very tricky one, especially if you have customers that are very much used to maybe networking, and the networking is everything. The network, that is my moat, that is my security perimeter. I need to take that to the cloud. And there's certainly elements of that, but obviously identity becomes a much bigger factor, a much bigger security perimeter when we look at the cloud. So I think when we start off with a customer and think about how do we educate, how do we get thinking about using the cloud, we tend to start off with kind of the identity and the governance piece, understanding kind of the place of the identity, kind of Azure Active Directory, things like conditional access and MFA, and really how important the identity is when we start looking at the cloud. And then we kind of think about governance, policies. On-prem, it's easy in a way. On-prem, you have these racks of equipment. You have these few people who are allowed to put things on the racks of equipment. And if you want something on that rack of equipment, you have to very ask nicely, maybe give them a cookie, whatever that might be. But they check your request. They go, oh, okay, I'm going to look at this. Yes, you're allowed to do that. Well, in the cloud, there is no person checking that request. It's all about kind of, I can just self-serve. I can deploy those things, which means you could get in a lot of trouble. And so it's important to think about the things that person used to do and check the checklist. Can I have a public IP here? and what replication should I be doing, I need to put that in place through governance. So we talk about things like Azure policy and tagging and RBAC and naming standards, all of that stuff. So we think about identity, think about governance, and then you can think about, okay, the networking, how are you connecting? How are we securing those? What are the resource deployments like templates or Bicep or Terraform? But that has to come after that identity and the governance, which is not very exciting typically, but you have to do that first. So that's something you kind of start with and then talk about the services on top of that.
I know you're wearing an Iron Man shirt. I'm curious, have you built any Azure services around like your training regimen or things that concern your daily life?
Yeah, I really haven't. No, I'm not that exciting. I mean, I'm an infrastructure person primarily, so I could, I guess, build a VM or something to log stuff on, but I'm not one of those exciting people that could build like a machine learning and, hey, look at the training you did on this day and how many calories. No, I keep them very, very separate. Sometimes while I'm training, it's funny, to your point, I'll watch like videos. I'll watch sort of YouTube things about technology. Like Saturdays, I do a 6 or 7 hour bike ride. And I'll often just watch YouTube videos. I'll have an iPad out in front of me and I'm just watching technology stuff. That's a big learning thing for me. But no, I've never done anything exciting around my training. I keep them very separate.
Yeah, how about that Bicep program that's come up recently?
Yes.
I couldn't help think of that.
I had to have, I did a video on that for my YouTube, and I had to kind of do a funny thumbnail for that because I get a lot of things about the training. So I don't know if you've done a lot, and the Bicep thing's awesome. I think actually as a technology, it was really needed. Like ARM JSON templates, okay, sure, they're great, they work, they're fantastic, but it was never really designed for a human being to write that thing. And so that's why people sometimes would go to things like Terraform. It wasn't because, hey, we needed Terraform because I need to deploy to this cloud and that cloud and on-prem, which is what Terraform is great for. It was because this ARM thing is ugly and I don't want to write it. So the nice thing about Bicep is it's actually human writable now, especially when you look at like the VS Code add-in and things. So, but I think Bicep's great. Hopefully we'll stop seeing ARM templates directly anymore and we can just kind of focus on the Bicep thing.
And now it finally occurred to me why it's ARM in Bicep.
Right.
Like I just thought they chose Bicep for a random reason. I never quite get it, but now it makes so much sense.
Yeah, your ARM and yeah.
And now you're stronger.
Do you know, I didn't actually.
Muscles.
I didn't get it at first either. I'm not gonna pretend like, oh, it's obvious. I think there was a good few weeks. I was like, why is it called Bicep? And there's like, oh yeah, ARM. Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, John, going to like initially why we invited you on, obviously for many other reasons, but how do you like accumulate all these knowledge when you have to work with the customer? How do you make sure that you're catching all the plates while they all fall at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about Azure, and it's a good thing and a bad thing, it's huge. I mean, the scope of Azure is just enormous. When you think about, well, there's infrastructure services, there's identity, there's security, there's data and AI, there's so many different services. I think to try and be an expert in all of them, I'm not smart enough to do that. So, I mean, that's just not saying I believe most humans are capable of being an expert in all of that stuff. So a key part, I think, is having a good team. So obviously I'm part of a team and I'm maybe the infrastructure specialist, but then there's a data and AI specialist, there's app dev specialists. So I tend to focus on the infrastructure space and I want to make sure, hey, I know what's happening in the infrastructure space, not just so I can architect it the right way, but if there's something new happening or coming, I want to make sure I'm guiding my customers so that we don't do something today that's going to preclude them from maybe taking advantage of something different tomorrow. So in terms of staying current, obviously we have kind of the Azure blog and we have the Azure kind of change log, and we post every time we do an update. We kind of post, hey, this is the change, it's preview, it's GA. And so I just spend time looking at that every morning. And the first thing I do is I go and look at the Azure update page. So I go and look at the Azure update page. I look at the Azure blog. I also look at things like the Azure AD blog. They sometimes post things that don't show up in other areas. and I just kind of make a note of what it is. If it's something I think is of interest, I might actually go and dive into the documentation later on in the day. I'll see if it's something I can try out. That's how I learn. I do not learn by reading, really. I'll read something and I can kind of get a vague gist of what it's trying to do, but it never resonates with me until I actually try and do the thing. I have to kind of get hands-on, and generally I don't learn it well unless it breaks. And fortunately, I break most things when I try and do something. Nothing ever works for me the first time. So you learn it when it fails, and then you try and work around and dive into it deeper. So those, I think, are the core resources for me: the Azure Update, kind of the Azure blogs, even LinkedIn. Like a lot of the product group people, and that they will post, hey, this new thing is out. That's a good way. The YouTube videos, they're always posting YouTube content now. So I'll kind of click the little watch later, I'll add it to my private list, and then during one of my training things, I'll watch that content to try and learn it. And I mean, I try and help others. So you said my YouTube channel. So every Sunday I post like a 20-minute, me at a whiteboard. What are the new features around infrastructure? But I really just focus on infrastructure. I don't really focus on kind of the app dev space or the AI. I probably don't understand it well enough to explain it anyway. So I really focus in that part of the world. I try and know what's happening at a very high level in the other areas. Because again, if you're going to architect something, you need to at least understand the concept about the other technologies and what they can do to make sure, hey, I'm not architecting something and reinventing the wheel. Actually, there's a service out here that does that really, really well. Let's go and dig into that. Let me bring in someone way smarter than me who can talk about that piece, and let's leverage that. So I think you need to have a very good picture of the all up story. But most of us are going to focus on a particular area to understand kind of a deep level. The only other thing I'd say about staying current is obviously the certifications have changed. We used to do this certification, it lasted for 2 years, and then 2 years later we'd go through this miserable panic of a couple of months trying to learn stuff and take this hideous exam and get the cert again. Well, now the certs, you just renew them each year online, but there's now this free learning course that kind of bridges the gaps of what's the new technologies over the past year. So I think that's actually a nice way of staying current as well. You go and take those things, and obviously that's a lot less frequent, but that will help.
Yeah, John, one of the challenges I've faced when trying to keep current is that you can keep current on the new stuff, but as you know, most enterprises cannot adopt all the new stuff, right? As you mentioned earlier, they have to go through this gigantic compliance process. And so, yeah, I mean, it's great to know all this stuff, but most companies can't use it right away. And so, I always struggle with how do you take the new stuff in, but also make it real for the customer? Make it such that it's actionable for them. You're just telling them, oh, you can do this with this new API or this new service. It does not really help them, right? But as you mentioned, maybe there's a way to kind of guide them so that in the future they can get there. I'm just wondering if that's something you face and how do you work around that?
Yeah, I mean, generally, customers don't care about a new feature as such. They care about what can help them in their business. There's that old kind of adage that when you go and buy a car, you hate the salesman trying to sell you the car, but you love to buy a car. So you don't want to be sold to. So just telling a customer, hey, there's this new feature, you should use it, that's meaningless. It doesn't help at all. But if you understand what they're trying to do, and that's kind of a key point, you have to know your customer, know what their objectives are, know what their goals are, what is their tactical and strategic direction. And then you can actually put things in place of, hey, look, I know we're struggling with this, or hey, I know we want to do Y. This thing we can actually leverage now to accomplish this. Or maybe, hey, we have these steps today. This process is going to make that simpler. So it's always framed in terms of what does it mean to the customer and how it helps them with their objectives. Just saying, hey, we have this cool new thing for the sake of the cool new thing. Yes, we like cool new things, but the customer's like, I don't care. Cool new things maybe means more headache for me. What is it going to do to help me? So that's how I think about it. It's like, okay, I know we're doing this. This would help. If it doesn't help, I'm generally not going to focus on that. I won't bring that up. I might want to play with it because it's cool and it's new and I like cool new things, but it doesn't mean necessarily that would translate to something useful for the customer.
John, going back to your earlier point about you enjoy breaking things and that's how you usually learn, how does that translate when you're working with customers? Because they obviously probably don't really want to see us breaking things while you're helping them architect something. Like, how do you bridge those gaps?
So I generally think about we have our own environments. So if something's like brand new and I'm trying to learn it, I'll set it up in my environment first if I can. Now, sometimes there's certain elements it's just not practical. I don't have an express route running in my environment that I can set up with FastPath, and there's limits. But I will try and always set the thing up in my environment first, and I will try and use it, and that's where I learn and where I break it. Then once I feel comfortable that I understand it, that's when you can then introduce it into the customer's environment in kind of proof of concept. Hey, look, let's do this together in your environment. Now, it's going to be different. They may have some strange things that you weren't anticipating and things break. But I think if you frame it as, look, we're going to do a proof of concept, we're going to work through this together, generally the customers want to learn it as well. And again, if it's just this instant thing, how well do they really learn it? So I think as long as it's framed as, and you don't just say, hey, there's this brand new thing, let's stick it in production. That's kind of a sad day for everyone. But as long as you put it in the correct phases, hey, look, there's this new way of doing things. Maybe it's a new technology, maybe it's a new configuration, maybe it's a new best practice, whatever that might be. Let's try it out. Let's have some test environment where we can together do a proof of concept. Hey, if there's a few hiccups, it's expected. We prove it out, make sure we have then an environment that is representative of prod, and then yes, we then maybe replicate that into production. Hopefully it's using some kind of declarative, be it Bicep or Terraform, something, some DevOps pipeline. I'm not manually clicking a button, because that's also generally a bad day.
Yeah, John, I'm interested, maybe this is a little more like harder to talk about, but it's like sometimes you work with a customer or someone who wants to go down a path that's probably not the right path, right? So maybe they want to hold on to an old technology, or they want to use something where we're not investing in it, right? We have a new path, right, that we're moving forward in. And I'm interested, like, how you kind of deal with those scenarios and how you get people back adjusted to the right path, so that they are successful, ultimately.
I wish I had the ultimate, I'm always successful in that conversation, but I am not. I will sometimes fail in that. I mean, what I will generally try and do is I love whiteboarding. And so what I will generally do with that type of scenario, if there's a disagreement in direction, I will try and demonstrate, hey, look, okay, so this is what we're doing today, or this is what you want to do. Look, here are the pros, and I'll use like a green pen for something good and a red pen for a problem or a pain point. And I'll say, this is what I think we could do. And again, you kind of show, well, what's the differences? What's the pro? What's the con with that? Also, sometimes I'll draw like dollar signs because maybe this new thing is cheaper and they are very cost conscious. Or I will just try and walk through. This is what we're doing. These are the pros and cons. This is what I think we could do. Here are the different pros and cons with this. Here's why I believe this will be beneficial for you. Here's maybe the additional work to move to this, but hey, I think longer term it's going to save you maybe X dollars, or it's going to save you X man hours or person hours in actually maintaining this thing, whatever that would be. So I would just try and have a discussion. I don't say, hey, you should do this and argue. It's okay, let's look at the 2 options or 3 options, whatever it is, and here are the pros and cons, and hopefully I'll obviously try and position it that there's more green on the way I want them to go and less of the red stuff. That's what I've done. It's generally successful, but it's not always. Sometimes you have the customers say, I don't want to do that. And yeah, they're the customer. The customer is always right, ultimately. And so you can say, okay, well, I understand that's your decision. So obviously we will help you with that. Maybe we could just come back to this in the future, and if possible, I'll at least try and leave it so that we could change in the future. At least try and get it to some position that even if it's not what we want to do, there is a path to the future that we could then go to what will be better, because maybe they have to experience a bit of pain or maybe experience this bigger cost than they thought, and then we can migrate. So at least I'll try and make sure I have some direction for the future. I can get it back to what we would consider optimal.
Yeah, John, well, I would say that in all of the work that I've done with customers in the infrastructure space, DNS and networking are always the cause for, I would say, 99% of the problems that they have. And you're nodding heads, and assume that you also see the same thing. I mean, I was wondering, like, how do you guide your customers so that they have a better experience when it comes to a smoother DNS or networking setup when it comes to Azure?
I mean, a lot of it today is we always talk about, for example, if you look at kind of the cloud adoption framework, and we have those kind of landing zone concepts. So I think as much as possible, like I like to keep it, was it the old keep it simple, stupid thing? Like, what do we need? So again, start off with what are the requirements? What are we trying to do? What is the isolation we need? What is the connectivity we need? What model can we put down to really enable that as simply as possible? Don't just put in technology for the sake of putting that in. Let's actually meet the requirements, making sure we're thinking about things like security, making sure we're thinking about performance. But I will always try and push towards let's meet the requirements using as a standardized pattern as we can. If I can use landing zones, for example, fantastic. They're proven out, they're used everywhere. I'm going to have less issues with that, as opposed to creating some very boutique type architecture with these weird things everywhere and just technology for the sake of technology. And especially what you tend to see is that technology for the sake of technology is when the company is still rooted in network is everything. Network is the security perimeter. They won't start adjusting to identity. And so you do these crazy things on the network that make your life so much harder because they won't trust the security. So again, it's trying to go back and say, well, okay, let's look at the way the security things work. Let's look at the identity and managed identities we can do, the system assign, the user assign, and look what magical stuff we can do with RBAC. And we don't need all these network things here. So that's my approach. I'll try and keep it simpler because yes, network, especially when you think about hybrid and on-prem to ExpressRoute or site-side VPN to a VNet to spokes to private endpoints, all this stuff. Yes, it gets complex, not just to implement, but then to troubleshoot. And so if I can keep it simpler, that's good for everyone.
Thank you. Cynthia, you want to close it out?
Yeah, I was going to ask any other questions for John, or John, do you have any departing thoughts you want to share?
No, I mean, I just think for most people, the best way to learn is to get hands-on. So if you have trouble getting access, there's like trial subscriptions you can get. There's services that's always free. Try and make sure you shut stuff down, deallocate it so you can really optimize that amount of money. But where possible, try and get hands-on and try the stuff out. For me personally, it's the best way to learn.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on to the show today, John.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.